Dr. Kuniko Ashizawa and Gale Mattox were talking today about a program at the Institute about how you reconcile countries. And of course, we've been working on how the German relationship with Israel, with Poland, with the Czech Republic, with France has evolved over the last 50 years. And we want to know, quite frankly, can that experience speak to similar efforts in East Asia or Northeast Asia or wherever? You're aware of that. You're aware of that project, and one wonders whether or not one could comment on that in terms of what would it take for the reconciliation process to occur between Japan, China, Korea, you name it, and can it possibly learn anything from the European experience? You've lived and worked in England. You know Europe. What do you think? Is it a possibility, or is it a non-starter?
There are many factors, of course, for the Japanese side in terms of our difficulty to reconcile with our neighbors or former the Asian neighbors which we fought previously, and then but from the what I understood from the German experience, to me, of course, there are again many factors probably had worked in German cases, but the one really the point which strikes me is that strong political leadership that coming from the German political system at the time, and then that the political leadership has not been, I think, kind of identified in the Japanese political system so far, and it also the difficulties we have with Asian countries has been worsened over the past few years because of the territorial issues with South Korea and China. And then as the things has getting more tense these days, it seems from the Japanese side, it seems more difficult for the Japanese politician to take again the sensible political leadership which they could learn from Germany. So yes, we can learn a lot from German side, but now at the moment, even that the discussion from Japanese politicians to just step back and then to learn from German experience, it has been lacking. And what we see from the Japanese political leadership over the past few years is just more like a reactive reaction or reactionary commentaries and action vis-a-vis the China and then also South Korea.
Now, one of the things that you said in our program here when you were speaking was that over the last 50 years or so, there's been a kind of a hub-spoke relationship, that the U.S. was very dominant player in the Asian sphere at the wish of countries like Japan and Korea, South Korea, and that, however, did not lead to relationships between the spokes. And so what does it take to get that kind of momentum going? I mean, you speak about territorial conflicts. Certainly the Chinese are having a big time conflict with the Japanese over these, as Americans would say, these rocks out there somewhere in the middle of the South China Sea. There is also, of course, the Korean situation, which seems to be getting worse every day. What would it take, in your view, to get that kind of dialogue going when, as I said before, almost everybody I talk to in this sphere, they all think they're victims. No one thinks other than that. Where do you find the common ground?
Yes, the U.S. kind of led the hub and spoke system has been one of the really important ingredients that why the East Asian countries, particularly Japan, were not able to reconcile with their neighbors among themselves. But I think we are at the point not to see many. It's kind of easy to blame the United States as a really important actor in the Asia-Pacific international relations. But I think now this is the time I believe all leaders in the East Asian capitals stopped indeed blaming the United States over the, I guess, past decade. But still, they were not able to take their own initiative to push harder for this more multilateral dialogues or even bilateral dialogues between the hubs. And then, as you said, yes, everyone kind of tend to victimize themselves, and then so that kind of again stop them from taking additional actions. How we could move, we could go beyond this kind of stalemate. Maybe the crisis, some kind of really serious financial crisis or security crisis takes place, then by necessity, those leaders may start talking to each other. That happened in late 1990s when we had the economic financial crisis in Asia. The three countries and also ASEAN countries got together to have to discuss to create East Asian grouping to discuss and deal with about this regional economic issues.
Some external.
But again, this is a little bit kind of lazy excuse to expect the crisis or really serious crisis that would help, maybe serves as like a catalyst for the new dialogue.
Let me come back to a catalyst as one that might work here, but it might be even reversed. But Gale, when you and I have looked at Germany for so many years, when you look at the way that Germany was able to thread the needle after 1945, it basically said, our way back into the European theater is through the European Union. Many Germans that you and I know didn't even want to be called Germans. They said, well, we're Europeans first and foremost. Now, you well know that there is some backlash effect now going on against the EU in Germany, not only a new party that was just founded against the Euro. Hungary, a few other countries are almost, it's like this sort of resentment toward the Euro and the European Union. Do you think that is going to get worse? And if so, doesn't that have another challenge for Germany to try to work through that? And because if it wasn't for Germany, the European Union probably wouldn't have had the same financial backing that it has enjoyed over the last 40, 50 years, right? And how do you see Europe avoiding a backlash effect after 50, 60 years of trying to push the European Union forward as we talk to Japan, China, and Korea and trying to say, well, maybe our experience is relevant because the Europeans have their own problems?
Well, I mean, I think that there's going to be a backlash. There's already started a backlash. It's probably, it seems to have taken everyone by surprise. On the other hand, we probably should have expected it somewhat. So I think that more the question is how to not let it get out of hand, and that takes leadership. It's going to take a tremendous
political leaders.
It's going to take a tremendous amount of leadership, and I do think that the automatic reaction is a positive one from the publics, but there are small groups, and they certainly could gain more momentum. But I don't know. I guess I tend to feel that it's in everybody's best interest not to let it get out of hand, and I'm just hoping that that's what's going to happen. For instance, in the case of this new party in Germany, that it won't get out of hand, and that German political leaders will see that there's a reason not to let it go too far, because the implications for it are more than just anti-EU. There's also this nationalist strain in the thing, and that is in that backlash, and that's not, and I think most people recognize that that's not a healthy direction for the EU to go in.
I mean, for years, isn't it the case, though, that Europe has been expanding, started out as 6, then it went on to 12, and now it's 27, will soon be 28 with Croatia. People were knocking at the door. They wanted to become members of this organization. They thought they would have much more benefits being inside the tent than outside the tent. There are obviously difficult times in austerity, and people can react to that. And for example, in the case of, let's take Finland even, where they have something called the Real Finns, a party that says, well, maybe this isn't in Finnish national interest. The narrative that went into building Europe was World War II. The narrative that went into building the European Union was as much looking back as it was looking forward. And I think that what I think now is that the European Union has got to restart that narrative and not just look back anymore, but they've got to look forward. They can't just completely always reference the fact that they came from a war, and they have to avoid another one. In Japan's case, can that external factor be China to push for the reconciliation? Because you are now seeing an increasingly powerful front, or I shouldn't say front, I should say a presence on the Asian stage. Does that somehow make the necessity of reaching accord and reaching across, building bridges and so forth, more urgent? Or
that happened indeed in the context of Southeast Asia, because the Southeast Asians have been feeling much stronger in terms of the growing influence from China. And what they did is they extended their hand to the United States, but also from Japan and also to India, to Japan and to India. So in that sense, the China factor indeed did work in terms of strengthen, really strengthen the function and role of ASEAN, Southeast Asian organizations. And then also the relationship between ASEAN and Japan and ASEAN and United States and ASEAN and India. But when it comes to the question of Northeast Asia or wider Asia Pacific or East Asian organization, China's factor or rise of China would probably have not been made positive implications so far, because China itself preferred more bilateral linkage or bilateral negotiation, and understandably, because particularly for instance, territorial issues, that China would feel more comfortable to deal with bilaterally the issues so that they can control, and also they can exert their influence on that issues. So the China's factor could work both, but probably it had been working well for the Southeast Asian countries, the Southeast Asian sub-regional institutions, but not other institutions in Asia.
Can I ask a question? And that is, you mentioned the EU and how important it was, Jack, but the other very important factor was, of course, NATO, which was even a couple of years earlier, that security organization, and the sense that Germany needed to be encompassed, and Germany recognized that there was a need for other European countries to feel that Germany was somehow prevented through a multilateral organization like NATO to be contained. And so I think NATO and the EU both had a role really in bringing Germany back into the international arena, back into Europe as a sort of normal player. And I wonder if I could just ask whether or not the North Korean threat might be any kind of impetus for some sort of security binding those countries together a little bit more in terms of security because of the threat from North Korea.
Yes and no. I mean, indeed, in order to deal with North Korea, all the relevant parties realized we need to do multilateral approach, which is called the SixParty Talks. The 6 countries of Northeast Asia and then Russia and the United States are part of this structures. But this framework has been, of course, really going through the difficult processes, because the North Korea's kind of resistance to be participating in this system, and because North Korea preferred the bilateral talk with the United States. So the North Korean threat does have does have both implications for this. The regional, possible Northeast Asian regional cooperation, but also maybe putting not just North Korea, but Japan and South Korea to prefer much stronger bilateral relationship with the United States. The reason why, because South Korea and Japan now have been feeling really strongly the threats from the North Korea. So they have like an immediate need to have deterrence, extended deterrence guarantee from the United States. And then again, two countries, I mean, Seoul and Tokyo, tend to look at more closely to the United States and to get the bilateral guarantee from the United States.
That's an interesting point, Gale, because the threat the Soviet Union represented created NATO, and therefore that was also a bonding agent. But again, to go back to the rationale for why we push forward in Europe, the narrative, I think, has to be, it needs some juice. You know, at this point of economic pressure and everybody worried about their futures, 500 million Europeans are trying to figure out what we do now to make this union stronger. It's difficult in times of austerity, in contrast to times when it's not so economically a squeeze. But if you base it on the principle that there is something with which Europeans can identify with, going back 2,000 years, if you will, you still have that. In your part of the world, in Japan, in Korea, in China, and elsewhere, there isn't quite that narrative. And so it strikes me that what you said before is probably that much more important, that someone's going to have to articulate the reason why that's important. And someone is going to have to build that into a way that people are going to be able to identify with it, be they in Japan, be they in China, and so forth. That's a tough task. And it's probably a long way down the road, isn't it?
That's a tough stuff. Well, of course, even if in the European case, you have really strong leadership in Germany and France, and both, in one sense, share the similar political structure and similar economic size. At the beginning of this, the European regional institution building experiments. At the moment, I think this the Japan and China do share this kind of similar economic structure, but the political structure between the two countries were completely, I mean, still, largely different. And also in terms of historical experience, Japan has been very minor, had been really minor player in terms of the Asian history. China had been always really dominant power. And then it had a system so-called Chinese tribute system. So the China was the center of the world at the time in Asia until mid, I think, 19th century. And then Japan was one of those tribute, small states to, in a way, koto the Chinese emperor. So this, the hierarchical situation still was in the memory, is in the memory in particularly Chinese political leaders, but also some Asian countries. So there's a really interesting kind of a comparison between the European or global international order, which kind of becoming more toward more kind of equal footing among the countries, and then based on the like institutions, proper institutions, and then there's understanding that each state has the same kind of sovereignty rights, political rights to each other. Whereas in Asia, still this kind of hierarchical situation, relationship between the powerful states and then other subordinate states, it's in one way or another in their mind. And then maybe China wants to kind of reclaim their position of that center of the Asia or center of the world, and then being on top of this hierarchical situation again. And this would not indeed easily lead to the creation of regional organization or regional institutions the way which was developed in Europe.
Right. So it might be a different path, but maybe toward a similar goal. We're going to wait for your book to come out to explain all this to us, which is coming out sometime in the fall. Thank you very much for being with us today, Gale. Good to have you back. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.